In the dark, frosty January sky of Kamensk-Uralsky, a small town in the south of Sverdlovsk region and in other cities across the country, people danced, sang, poured champagne and wished each other a happy upcoming 1993 amid the flashes of New Year's fireworks. Some sat at noisy tables surrounded by family, others celebrated the holiday at work, and still others had fun visiting friends. The world was celebrating the arrival of the new year. Everyone believed it would be better than the previous one. But behind the closed doors of apartment number 6 in the 3-story building at 15 Vtoraya Rabochaya Street, there was silence. 7 lifeless bodies were scattered throughout the rooms of the small apartment. For them, the next year never came. The Ivanovs from Kamensk-Uralsky were a completely ordinary family, husband and wife, Lyudmila and Vladimir, and their 2 children. Cheerful, sociable, hardworking people. Both were born and raised here, and they fell in love back in school. Then Vladimir went to the army, and Lyudmila faithfully waited for him. When he returned, he immediately proposed to her, and she gladly accepted. They started living together with his parents in a small private house in the Silikatny settlement. Soon, children were born, little Svetlana and Andrei, close in age, smart and beautiful, just as children born in love and harmony are expected to be. Vladimir worked as a driver in a motor convoy, starting with a Zavod imeni Likachova truck, but he was highly respected for his responsible and calm character. And appreciating his hard work and easygoing nature, the boss offered him a job as a bus driver. Volodya gladly agreed. The salary became higher, which was very helpful for the young family. Lyudmila, a lively and cheerful laugher, graduated from a trade school in Sverdlovsk and worked as a saleswoman in the local grocery store. She handled the team excellently, always got along with everyone, and was reliable and friendly. She never shortchanged customers and soon rose from an ordinary saleswoman to become the head of the department. Revenue immediately increased, and the director, seeing the woman's efforts, often gave her bonuses. Sveta and Andrei went to school, studied well, and attended modeling and sewing clubs. The older Sveta helped her brother with his studies, and neither of them ever shirked household chores. There was always comfort and mutual understanding in the family. Life got even better when their turn came and they received a 2-room apartment in a new building. During the Soviet era, families with children were given comfortable apartments for free, but they had to wait their turn for housing. Now we'll save up for a car so we can take the family to resorts, Vladimir liked to dream. Lyudmila looked at her husband affectionately and hid her happy eyes, delighted by his practicality and thriftiness. And even though they wanted to buy a simple Zaporozhets, the cheapest car in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the thought of having their own car made them very happy. "Just make sure you don't disappear in the garage like some men do," she said with feigned strictness, and together they burst into cheerful laughter. In Soviet times, buying a new car was not an easy task. It wasn't enough to just save up the required amount. You also had to wait in line with others who wanted one. Sometimes people waited for their coveted car for years, but the dreams of this happy family, like those of many others, were not meant to come true. The difficult times of change after the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics taught people to adapt to any, even the harshest living conditions, and no matter what, not to lose faith in a better future. The turbulent 90s forced many people to give up their previous grand plans and savings. The Ivanovs could only afford a good furniture set. "Here you go, Dad, Vova and the car," Lyudmila would joke. Her husband didn't take offense, he just smiled guiltily and hugged her, whispering that they would have everything someday. And indeed, having adapted to the new realities, they lived quite well. Vladimir's boss often gave him jobs transporting people to the regional center and back. The extra income was very helpful. Since salaries were often delayed, Lyudmila was able to get groceries on credit at the grocery store. That's how they managed to get by. It was around that time that the government issued vouchers, securities that gave people the right to a share of former socialist property. Each one had a face value of 10,000 rubles. They gave out one per person, but ordinary people didn't understand much about securities. and prices were rising so fast that soon you could only buy 3 bottles of vodka with a voucher, and that's if you were lucky. Lyudmila, who had spent her whole life working in trade, quickly realized that she could profitably exchange vouchers for groceries or alcohol from the store instead of her salary. "We'll buy a whole lot of vouchers, sell them in Yekaterinburg for a higher price, and buy out my store, or at least a grocery kiosk, so I can work for myself." She shared her dreams with Galina, the wife of Vladimir's cousin, but just like with the car, her dreams were not meant to come true. The Ivanovs decided to celebrate the new year of 1993 at home. "Why should the 4 of us just sit around bored with the kids?" "Let's invite your brother and his wife," suggested Lyudmila. "They already made plans with friends to celebrate. I invited them recently," Volodya replied. "Then let's call the Gelevs. They haven't been home in a long time. Let them visit," she insisted. "Then let them bring Seryoga Verzakov along too. I haven't seen him in ages, ever since he became the principal of the boarding school." Volodya picked up the idea. They had been longtime friends with Svetlana and Viktor Gelev. Svetlana and Lyudmila were close, having grown up together since birth. Then fate brought Svetlana to Perm, where she met her future husband, who was 15 years younger than her. But the family was exemplary. They often called the Ivanovs, maintained friendly relations, and came to visit. Sergei Verzakov was a longtime friend of Vladimir, who had been assigned to Perm during Soviet times. In the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, after university, graduates were assigned jobs, and the work could be in another district or even another region. He was now working as the director of a boarding school in the village of Bryukhovo. Despite the distance between them, the friends kept in touch. The Ivanovs always loved lively and cheerful gatherings, and no celebration ever took place without relatives and numerous friends. Lyudmila was an excellent cook and always a welcoming hostess. Of course, this didn't add to her slimness, but the guests would constantly praise her dishes and ask for her recipes. There was no internet back then, and culinary masterpieces were passed from hostess to hostess by word of mouth. That's how the salads, herring under a fur coat, and Olivier gained popularity. After calling their friends, they agreed to meet them at the Kamensk-Uralsky railway station. It was only a kilometer away from the Ivanov family's house. They would take a train from Perm to Yekaterinburg, and there they would wait for the commuter train. "And to us," chirped his wife, anticipating long conversations at the festive table and cheerful New Year's holidays. They hadn't seen the Permians for a long time, and she was eager to share her news and listen to stories about the lives of old friends. The commuter train was delayed, and the Ivanovs were noticeably nervous, since there were only 40 minutes left until New Year's. "What if it's late? Then we'll celebrate New Year's at the station," she thought anxiously, peering into the distance along the dark line of the tracks. Finally, 2 bright yellow lights appeared, and Lyudmila sighed with relief. There weren't many people meeting the train, all of them familiar faces from their silicate settlement. The train that had stopped was the last one this year. The couple carefully peered into the windows slowly passing by. Finally, the train came to a stop. From the open doors, along with the warm steam, late passengers tumbled out. "Well, finally!" Lyudmila exclaimed with joy when the guests from Perm approached them, hurrying and discussing something on the go. After hugging and kissing them, Vladimir noticed that a little further away stood another unexpected guest. A tall young man, well dressed, seemed to be apologizing with his whole demeanor for ending up at the meeting place of old friends. Gelyova took Lyudmila by the arm, led her aside, and began to explain something to her. While listening, Lyudmila glanced at the unfamiliar guy with undisguised pity. At the end of the conversation, she nodded sympathetically to Gelyova. A couple of minutes later, they joined the others. After a brief conversation, Lyudmila's husband looked at her approvingly and gave the stranger a friendly smile. Emboldened, he approached the group. They introduced themselves, shook hands firmly, and all together, laughing, quickly headed to the Ivanov family's house. They couldn't abandon the man at the station as he had nowhere to go. The table at home was ready, with enough space for everyone to stay the night. There were only 25 minutes left until the chimes struck midnight. Perhaps the most beloved holiday in the post-Soviet space is New Year's. On this night, adults become like children, happy and cheerful. They laugh, joke, light sparklers, and wholeheartedly rejoice when their children are visited by Ded Moroz and Snegorochka. Kind wishes and the clinking of glasses can be heard everywhere. And after the chimes strike midnight, the kids race to set off fireworks, and after them, the parents, flushed from champagne, come outside at a leisurely pace. In the courtyard of building number 12 on 2nd Rabochaya Street, everything was the same, but among the residents outside, the Ivanovs were nowhere to be seen. Lyudmila prepared so much delicious food that nobody wants to leave the table, the neighbors joke. And glancing at the glowing windows of their apartment, they immediately forget about it. Hurrying to the city Christmas tree, proudly towering near the administration building of Kamensk-Uralsky. After all, it's New Year. The festive night was noisy and cheerful. Light, fluffy snow was falling, and the stars shone brightly, as if rejoicing together with the people. Fireworks soared into the sky from time to time. Carefree groups strolled through the streets, wholeheartedly congratulating everyone they met on the holiday. Behind apartment doors, music and cheerful laughter could be heard until morning. Only at dawn did the city sink into a sweet sleep, the kind that comes only after unrestrained, universal merrymaking. The next day, Vladimir didn't go out on his route. That had never happened before. Even if he wasn't feeling well, he always gave advance notice. The duty car that arrived early in the morning to pick up the drivers for their shift left without him, since he never showed up. After noon, the head of the motorcade, Viktor Vodolasov, came to his house. He went up to their floor and rang the doorbell for a long time, but no one answered, even though it was clear from the street that the light was on in the room. At that moment I thought maybe they went somewhere and just forgot to turn off the light. Before, Volodya had never disappeared so strangely. I decided that when Volodya showed up I would give him a talking to, recalls Viktor. Once, annoyed, he left. And Lyudmila had time off until January 3rd, so no one noticed her absence. January 5th, a strange nauseating smell appeared in the stairwell. The concerned residents went up to the second floor. The smell was coming from the Ivanov family's apartment, but they still didn't open the door. There was a deathly silence inside, and the light in the room was still on. Confusion turned into anxiety, recalls the Ivanov's neighbor, Galina Nikolaevna. My friend's husband put a ladder up to their window and climbed up. When he looked inside, he immediately recoiled, almost falling down. He turned to us with a pale, frightened face and said that they were all lying on the floor. The police arrived quickly. They went upstairs through the balcony using the ladder. The balcony door was slightly open, and a sickly sweet, unpleasant smell immediately hit our noses. The police officers knew what that meant and prepared for the worst. After overcoming their nausea, they went inside. A gruesome scene awaited them in the apartment. Among the overturned chairs and scattered dishes in congealed pools of blood lay the corpses, the apartment owners and their guests, 7 people in total. What shocked the seasoned investigators was that all of them, even the children, had been mercilessly beaten to death with a heavy blunt object, most likely a hammer. Vladimir was unrecognizable. His head was so mutilated by the blows that there wasn't a single untouched spot. The bodies of the Gelevs, with their skulls smashed, were found under the beds. While they were sleeping, they were struck several times and then thrown to the floor. Sergei Verzakov was seen next. His corpse was lying in another room. There were terrible wounds gaping on his head. According to the neighbors, there should be 2 more children left in the apartment. The investigators were hoping until the end that the kids had miraculously survived. Sveta, who was 13, and Andrei, who was 12, tried to hide in the bathroom, but it didn't save them. They were dealt with just as cold-bloodedly and mercilessly. But what kind of monster or monsters could have done something like this? And most importantly, why? News of the monstrous massacre spread through the town in an instant. People whispered the terrible details to each other, looking around as if the criminals could be nearby and listening in. People just couldn't believe that the close-knit family was gone. Friends and co-workers cried, collected money for the funeral, and no one could understand one thing. Why? Leonid Semenovich is Vladimir's cousin. The last time I saw Volodya was when he was hurrying to the store. He said his wife had asked him to buy apples for the holiday table. He repeated his invitation to us, we congratulated each other and parted ways, as it turned out, forever. Neither Volodya nor Lyudmila ever did harm to anyone in their lives. Both are the kindest, most open people, and children can only dream of having such parents, hardworking, affectionate, and great helpers around the house. An investigative team arrived from Sverdlovsk, led by the head of the Kamensk-Uralsky Ministry of Internal Affairs, Vladislav Ignatov, and they immediately got to work. The Ivanov family's apartment door was locked from the inside with no signs of forced entry. That means the owners themselves let the criminals in and were acquainted with them. Someone clearly wished harm upon this family. The search for possible enemies and ill-wishers began. Meanwhile, the pathologists discovered that the blood of the adult victims contained not only alcohol, but also a powerful psychotropic substance, presumably a sleeping pill. Lyudmila's husband didn't drink that night, so he could have resisted, but obviously he didn't expect the attack and didn't have time to defend himself. The other guests were sleeping soundly and only woke up from the blow of the hammer when their injuries already prevented them from resisting or screaming. The neighbors and relatives who were interviewed spoke about the victims, only good things. A hard-working and close-knit family, they never got in anyone's way. Sociable and friendly, always ready to help, they simply couldn't have become victims of someone's revenge. Could the Ivanovs and their guests have died as a result of a gang attack? Did they have any debts? The investigators and Vladimir's brother, Leonid, answered this question. They had no dealings with local gangs and never borrowed money from anyone. They lived modestly and honestly. And everything at Lyuda's store was clean and transparent. They didn't sell illegal goods or counterfeits, and they definitely had no ties to criminals. Both of them were law-abiding and didn't get involved in any risky schemes. The investigators' theory of a robbery became the main one, since all the valuables and money disappeared from the apartment. The vouchers that Lyudmila had been saving for so long were also missing. And then someone from their acquaintances remembered seeing the Ivanovs on New Year's Eve. They were meeting guests from the train and on their way back passed by. He remembered exactly. There were 4 guests, 3 men and a woman. It was hard to make out the appearance of the visitors in the dark. The only thing that stood out was that one of the men was tall. The accidental witness had never seen him here before. The investigators had to find out where this man came from and where he disappeared to later. His identity could shed light on the crime. Perhaps he is the very criminal who took the lives of the Ivanovs and their friends. It was very important for the detectives to find the passengers of the train on which the guests arrived. Announcements appeared in newspapers and on television asking fellow travelers who rode with the victims on that train on December 31st to come forward. People were soon found. They described the appearance and the few distinguishing features of their fellow travelers. The investigation suggests that someone else was traveling with the victims, someone who was in contact with them for quite a long time. This was told to the Kamensky worker in January 1994 by the head of the City Department of Internal Affairs, Vladislav Ignatov. A slender man, aged between 23 and 27, about 180 centimeters tall, was riding on the train with the Gelevs. He was wearing a brown sheepskin jacket with a black astrakhan-type fur collar and a hat made of fur that looked like nutria fur. On the train, he was very actively talking with the Gelevs and Vazakov. It was also established that during the New Year's celebration in the Ivanovs' apartment, there were some conflicts. The residents of the apartment went out to the stairwell more than once, Vladislav Ignatov clarified. Presumably the robber or robbers left the apartment in the early morning through the balcony and could have left the settlement by any means of transportation. All the fingerprints in the apartment belonged to the Ivanovs or their guests, except for one set of prints belonging to the perpetrator. It was up to the investigation to find him. A composite sketch of the visitor was made and bulletins were sent to all police departments. The Ministry of Internal Affairs of the 2 regions, Sverdlovsk and Perm, checked all repeat offenders who could in any way be connected to the monstrous crime. Questioning the Perm relatives and friends of Gelev and Verstakov showed that they didn't have such an acquaintance, and he couldn't have come from Perm with them. The investigation determined the acquaintance happened during a transfer somewhere at the station in Yekaterinburg. The commuter train to Kamensk-Uralsky had a long wait, and getting acquainted helped pass the time. But how do you find witnesses? A big city train station is hundreds of people, meeting briefly and then heading off in different directions. Looking for eyewitnesses in a place like that is simply pointless, and there were no surveillance cameras back then. Only one thing is clear: the criminal gained the trust of ordinary good-natured people, and they didn't refuse his request and invited him to join them for a New Year's celebration. The Ivanovs were renowned for their hospitality throughout the area. By taking in the future criminal, they essentially signed their own death warrant. Sometimes kindness shown to strangers turns into terrible evil. The investigation reached a dead end. None of the suspects could have committed this crime. The jewelry stolen from the Ivanovs did not turn up in any pawn shops or with well-known private buyers. The fingerprints of the unknown person did not match any of the criminal cases known to the police. There wasn't a single lead to grab onto and continue the investigation. Most likely, the criminal decided to lay low and hide out in a safe place for a while the police are searching for him hot on his trail. So the fiend managed to avoid the punishment he deserved. The entire city attended the funeral of the Ivanov family. Hundreds of people, both friends and strangers, brought flowers and wreaths to their single shared grave. Representatives of the administration, teachers, co-workers and journalists from Yekaterinburg and Moscow came. Television channels were all reporting the details of the nightmare. The whole country was shocked by the monstrous cruelty of what had happened. In the Kamensk-Uralsky newspaper on January 15, 1993, there was an article about that very terrible night. Here are some memories about relatives and acquaintances, about the family that died 32 years ago. Alexander Nikolaevich Tokmin, head of the passenger enterprise. Of course, we were all shocked by what happened and did everything we could for our former colleague and his family. As for the money, it's just as much a tradition as the columns of cars in a funeral procession. If one of the drivers passes away, everyone feels it is their duty to contribute some amount for the funeral. And in this case, it was an even greater tragedy. Halina is the wife of Volodymyr's cousin. Usually if there were guests, he always helped her. Probably, the guys even washed the dishes from the New Year's table when all the guests went to bed after the feast. The kitchen was all cleaned up, everything was put in order. Lyudmila Stepanova Korneva, homeroom teacher of the 7th grade at school number 14. Sveta studied in my class. She was everyone's favorite. She was a very kind girl, calm, balanced and composed. Besides that, she was very sociable and could find an approach to anyone. She was able not only to come up with an idea, but also to make it happen. Sveta was a positive leader in the class, our helper. The high-profile case of the Kamensk-Uralsky maniac ended up on the archive shelf, where for years other similarly unsolved cases were gathering dust. Time passed, the tragedy gradually began to fade from memory. Kamensk-Uralsky went on with its life, generations changed. The relatives of the victims had already lost hope that the old case would be solved and the criminal caught. Only every year on January 1st, fresh flowers were placed at the grave of the Ivanovs in the cemetery in memory of that dreadful evening back in 1993. But forensic science does not stand still. Research in the field of human DNA studies made it possible to detect microscopic particles on the surface of objects. They are called sweat and grease traces. Forensic experts have learned to extract DNA structure from them. By comparing it with the DNA samples of the suspect, it is possible to determine with 100% certainty whether he was present at the crime scene and whether he came into contact with the physical evidence or not. This can be compared to a person's autograph on a document. In scientific terms, this is called genetic fingerprinting. A huge number of crimes around the world have been solved thanks to the discovery of this technology. According to the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs, about 6,000 cases that were previously closed and stored in archives have been reopened for further investigation, and the people who committed them have been found. Their traces remained on items from the scene of the tragedy and on the weapons used in the crimes, which were kept in the evidence storage rooms of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. By comparing them with the database, investigators were able to identify the perpetrator with 100% certainty. In 2024, the relatives filed a petition to reopen the high-profile case of the Ivanov family's death, and it was sent for further investigation. The physical evidence from the crime scene was a hammer which was used to kill the victims. It was necessary to analyze the DNA from its handle and compare it with the database of the Ministry of Internal Affairs at that time. In the year 2024, the officers of the Investigative Committee of Russia for the Sverdlovsk region thoroughly analyzed the materials of the criminal case and determined which additional forensic examinations needed to be conducted. Taking into account the emerging modern expert capabilities and technologies, they outlined versions of what happened. As a result of the work carried out, thanks to the conclusions of a number of forensic examinations, including molecular genetic analysis, it was possible to identify the alleged perpetrator, said acting head of the Investigative Committee of Russia for the Sverdlovsk region, Colonel of Justice Konstantin Miroshnichenko. One of the January evenings of 2025, the city of Blagoveshchensk in the Amur region, a police car drove up to the house of 52-year-old electrician Viktor Petrichenko. Again, my son must have messed something up, thought Viktor, and reluctantly threw on his jacket and went out into the yard. It was already getting dark, and the cold wind made him pull his jacket tighter. Shoving his hands into his pockets, he slowly walked down the porch. Pulling a cigarette from the pack, he suddenly stopped. Contrary to expectations, it wasn't the juvenile affairs officers who got out of the car. 4 police officers armed with assault rifles, wearing uniforms labeled Special Rapid Response Unit, and an elderly major from the Ministry of Internal Affairs were rapidly approaching the man. His worried wife ran out onto the porch, her heart pounding anxiously in her chest as she sensed something was wrong. They had never had visitors like this before. What has he done this time? He gave up crime a long time ago, he promised. Flashed through her mind. Citizen Petrichenko. The major's eyes drilled into him with icy sharpness, but Viktor replied carelessly. Years in prison had taught him not to fear such looks and not to believe in the operative's feigned severity. He was clean before people and the law, and he had served his time for his past sins, buying weapons and theft. From bell to bell. Home, work, family, everything was in order. "You are under arrest," the voice said calmly and firmly. 3 police officers surrounded him, blocking any attempt to escape, but Viktor didn't even think about running. "On what grounds? I know my rights." "You are suspected of committing a crime under Article 105 of the Criminal Code." "Let's go." Petrichenko knew this article. Back in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, you could not only serve 10 years for it, but also get the death penalty. "I didn't kill anyone. I didn't take anyone's life. You're mistaken. I quit many years ago, and I've already served time for my past." His eyes filled with anger, his lips twisted into a sinister grin, and his fists clenched on their own. The barrels of the assault rifles pointed at his chest quickly brought him back to his senses. "You only served time for what was uncovered. You." He thought that Major wanted to add something else, but when he looked at Petrichenko's wife, who was watching them warily, he fell silent. "Let's go," said the Major and nodded toward the car. So its comeback flashed through Viktor's mind. It was as if a sharp electric shock went through his body. Slowly putting his hands behind his back, he trudged toward the gate. His wife and 17-year-old son silently watched as he got into the UAZ without even looking in their direction. He understood everything and knew that he wouldn't see them for a long time, maybe even never again. Half an hour later, Petrichenko, with his head down, was sitting in the office of the investigator for especially important cases at the Blagoveshchensk District Department of Internal Affairs, listening to the results of the fingerprint examination. He absent-mindedly fiddled with the edge of the faded tablecloth. Old memories were coming back to him more and more vividly. A woman covering her head, begging for mercy, children, easy money, wandering from city to city, random acquaintances, thefts, the trial, Amur Aiki 8. After being released, there came a time of reflection, meeting his future wife, new values, and a new life. But now the past was cruelly taking away his present and future, just as he once took lives. It was useless to deny it. I knew they would come for me someday, he whispered barely audibly. But the investigator paid no attention to this. There was a pen and paper on the table. He began to write, recalling how everything happened, every little detail. And what used to seem clear and simple to him 30 years ago now began to terrify him. Time had changed him, but he could no longer change time. In the cell, with a dim lamp on the ceiling and a pile of some papers, Viktor sat and listened. Sergei Kolosovsky, the court-appointed lawyer, understood perfectly well who he was dealing with. But work is work. Even the most notorious scoundrels and murderers need someone to defend them by law. The prospects didn't look too bad. He will definitely be able to avoid a life sentence. It's been more than 15 years since the crime was committed, which means his client faces between 8 and 20 years in prison. There is even a theoretical possibility that due to the statute of limitations expiring, he could be pardoned, but there have been no such precedents in his practice, or in the entire legal practice of Russia. Kolosovsky knew that the relatives of the victims were demanding the maximum sentence for his client. It makes sense to conduct a forensic psychiatric examination. That's what being a lawyer is about, to get the sentence reduced. You can't bring people back, but a successfully closed case will only benefit your career. Taking all factors into account, you can expect a prison sentence of no more than 15 years, he began. The usual kind of talk at such meetings. Petrichenko stared at the floor with detachment, showing no interest in what he heard. I will file a motion to review the case, taking into account the statute of limitations. Shut up, his client interrupted him harshly. You think I want to go home faster? Don't you get it? I don't have a home anymore? Petrichenko looked at the lawyer angrily, as if he was to blame for all his sins. When everyone finds out what I did 32 years ago, they won't even let me cross the threshold. How can my son handle something like that? And what will my wife say? She'll spit in my direction. Children were present, but I felt no remorse. My thoughts were consumed by money and about the witnesses to make sure no one was left. He fell silent when he heard the guard's footsteps outside the door and whispered, "Do what you have to do. Whatever sentence I get is mine. There's no way back for me." Minutes later, he walked down the familiar corridor to his cell. His life now belonged for a long time to these stone walls and the small barred window. Petrichenko will remain in the Yekaterinburg detention center until March 8th. After the trial, where the relatives of the deceased Ivanovs from Kamensk-Uralsky will be present, he will most likely be sent to a penal colony. Most likely for a long time. And he will come out an old man, sick and unwanted if he comes out at all. After so many years of a cloudless life, retribution for his cruel crime found him and punished him, taking away everything most precious he had, his home, his family, his job, his friends, and his good name. His son will be called the son of a maniac, and people will stop greeting his wife. They will probably have to leave Blagoveshchensk and move far away, forgetting their former life, but it's unlikely they'll be able to forget who they lived with. There is no statute of limitations for villainy, there is the crime, and sooner or later there will be punishment for it.